Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Gloria Frost about medieval views of divine and creaturely causation.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Gloria Frost, professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Gloria's work focuses on medieval philosophy and especially issues in metaphysics in the medieval period. She's the author of a book called Aquinas on Efficient Causation and Causal Powers, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. She's working on another book that she calls Divine and Created Causation in Medieval Philosophy. And that's the topic that we've asked Gloria to talk about with us today. So welcome to the show, Gloria. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will or issues in theology that are related to free will?
Yeah. So thanks so much for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be part of this podcast with many distinguished interviewees that you have on here. So a little bit about myself. You've covered kind of the basics of where I am now. But I did my undergrad at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and I actually decided to go to school there to be on the swim team and to experience life in D.C., and I had no idea what philosophy was. And at that university, all the undergrads have to take 4 required philosophy classes, and it was really just in those first philosophy classes I took as an undergrad that I got interested in questions of free will, and especially how God's causation relates to freedom. So at the Catholic University, we also studied theology, and there are a lot of religious questions and influences in the philosophy department as well. And I just found those questions fascinating. And for me, it really, I think, is like just a central issue to really evaluate the coherence of theism, whether it's compatible with free will. Because I personally think that free will is very important for maintaining human responsibility and just making sense of our agency in the world as human beings. And so for me as an undergrad, it just seemed really important for evaluating the theistic worldview to see, is that compatible with human freedom? And those issues just continue to interest me throughout my training in philosophy. I went on to Notre Dame for my PhD, and there were a lot of people working on divine and created causation there, like Alvin Plantinga, of course, Tom Flint, Fred Freddoso, and my courses with them were just really influential for thinking about the issues we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Our topic today is divine causation and creaturely action. Could you give us and our audience some background? What are some issues in this debate, and what else should we know before looking at some of the views on offer?
Okay, yeah, great question. So traditional theists in the Christian tradition, Islamic tradition, and Judaism typically maintain that God creates everything that exists. And traditionally, not only was it held that God created everything, but also that he sustained everything in existence. So he constantly is causing everything as it's existing, not just at the point of origin when it begins to exist. And so that raises the question, if God's causality is all pervasive, of what room is there for creatures to cause effects? And especially with free will, the question gets raised of how is God's causing and sustaining our actions compatible with our freely causing them as well? So consider the example of me just freely talking right now on the podcast. Like, I believe I freely accepted the invitation and freely here talking with you guys today. But the traditional religions, historically speaking, have held that God right now is causing me and sustaining me as I'm participating in this conversation, that, the movements of my mouth and my vocal cords are held in being by God and caused by him as well. So that raises the question of what, if anything, is left for me to cause? Is it just all God? And is my free will an illusion? Or, even if you think I play a role in causing my actions as well, we've got the question of the division of labor. So what do I do and what does God do? So that's kind of the basic issue at stake, in the debate. And, there are a variety of different ways that medieval authors have tried to wrestle with these questions over time.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's helpful
Mhm.
background. Speaking of medieval authors, you recently contributed a chapter to an edited volume called Philosophical Essays on Divine Causation, published by Routledge in 2022. And your chapter's on three competing views of God's causation of creaturely actions, and you focus on three medieval figures. We want to ask you to say something about each of these, but let's start with Thomas Aquinas, whose name will be familiar to regular listeners of this podcast. What is Aquinas's instrumental model of divine and created causality?
So really, one of the starting background points of Aquinas's approach to these issues is this idea that um, only God has the power to cause being. So Aquinas thinks that the powers creatures have to cause effects are really perfections in the creature itself. So God, let's take an ordinary example first. So fire, for example, can heat other things because fire is hot. It has this perfection in it and has this ability through that perfection to communicate that same way of being to another. So Aquinas, with that kind of background in mind of thinking about powers and capacities, he thinks only God has that power to communicate being or existence to things. So God is, in Aquinas's system, like pure, unlimited perfection. So being in every, with every perfection and a necessary existing being. And Aquinas thinks it takes a sort of mode of existing like that to be able to communicate being to other things, to call other things into existence from non being. So he thinks creatures just simply don't have that power. In his view, creatures have this power, have a power to specify beings when they cooperate with God. God can cooperate through his power to cause beings,
Hmm.
can allow creatures to act as instruments to specify being in a particular way. So let's get into that analogy Aquinas makes of the instrumental model, kind of where that name comes from that I've applied to his model. So Aquinas says, we can think about the division of labor between God and creatures almost the way an artisan uses a tool to cause an effect. So consider a person, Aquinas's example, who makes a bed with using a saw. So that saw, it doesn't have the power to make beds of itself. A saw can't just, start moving around and carving a bed. But the saw does have a power to cut of itself. So when a saw is used in making a bed, the saw acts through the bed maker, the artisan's power to cause beds or to cause benches or tables. But the saw really does contribute something of itself through its power to cut. So a bed maker wouldn't pick up a hammer, for example, to saw woods. Like there's something native to that saw that allows it to be useful and to contribute to that act of bed making. So applying this to God and creatures, so like the bed maker using the saw, Aquinas thinks that creatures participate in an action that goes beyond their powers, but they also contribute something to the action through their native powers. So let's think about an example of a dog that generates another dog. So the dog parent, it doesn't have the power to create, to cause a new being to exist, but it does have a power to specify that a dog exists rather than a cat or a frog. So when the dog generates another dog, God supplies that power to cause being, but the dog is responsible for specifying that a dog is caused rather than a cat or a frog or some other type of animal. So on Aquinas's model, creatures act through God's power when they bring new effects into being. It's God's power to call things into being that's being exercised there through the creature, but the creature's native powers really contribute to specifying the type of being that exists. And so you might be wondering, since we're on the free will podcast, well, how does this relate to free will? So Aquinas thinks that even our acts of will require God's power to call them into being, to bring them into existence. But he says that we retain through our wills the power to specify the object of that which we will. So just like the dog specifies that a dog is caused rather than a cat, when it causes an effect, I specify that I will the vanilla ice cream cone rather than the chocolate one when I'm in the ice cream parlor, for example. So our will really does play a role in specifying what type of will act is caused, but God's power to cause existence is used there to by the will to cause a new effect. And Aquinas thinks that it's only God really that can cause an act of will without violating its freedom, and that's because God causes the will's act from the inside by causing the being of it, rather than acting on it from outside to try to coerce it or steer it towards a certain option in its willing.
Can I ask a clarifying question about the dog example?
Sure.
So the way you phrased it, the dog has the power to specify whether it's a dog rather than a cat, and it sounds like maybe it's within the dog's power to bring about a cat when it's phrased like that.
Yeah, sorry. I guess I think I just phrased it wrong. What I meant to say is just that the dog's powers really determine that a dog is caused through God's power.
So could we say something like the dog has the power to bring about the dog rather than not bring about a dog?
Yeah, you could.
Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, you could say more that like the ex. What I'm trying to maybe get at is just the idea is that the creature's powers specify the type of effect that's caused. So every effect, it's an existing thing, but it also has an essence or a type in Aquinas's view. And it's the creature through its causality that specifies the natural kind or the essence of the effect that's caused.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
when God cooperates with dogs, dogs are caused. When he cooperates with cats, cats are caused.
Yeah, so the dog's nature determines what it's able to bring about. Yeah, okay. So another view you explain is John Duns Scotus's view that God and creatures are independent co-causes. Could you tell us about Scotus's view now?
So Scotus has a kind of some key differences in his metaphysics of powers from Aquinas's. So Scotus doesn't have any issue with imagining that a creature would have the power just to bring an effect into being totally through its own power. Of course, he thinks that creatures are always sustained in existence by God, but as they're being sustained, he thinks it's, within the nature of a created power that it could be the total immediate cause of its effect. He's not so concerned as Aquinas is with that issue of, having that power of being belonging to God, or that power of causing being belonging to God alone. He's fine with creatures having a power to, cause being through their powers. But he's really concerned about the issue of maintaining God's omnipotence and omniscience. So he thinks, at least at certain points in his works, that in his career, that the way that God knows the future is by knowing what he himself wills and causes, for those future objects. And so he's concerned that if creatures cause things totally on their own without God being an immediate cause of their effects, that then God isn't going to be able to know the future. And he also has concerns about omnipotence and the way God would be able to exercise control over what effects are brought into being or not. So he does say God could, if a creature was going to cause something that God, didn't want to happen in his providence, that God could simply overpower that cause from the outside. But he thinks that's just unfitting, that God shouldn't be wrestling and overpowering creatures. So he, at least in certain points in his career, likes a model where God is also cooperating and co-causing with creatures immediately to bring their effects about, because then God can simply withhold that cooperation and you don't get the effects that any effect that God would want to, not have part of creation. So his motivations, just as some background, are a little bit different for Aquinas for, coming to that conclusion that God cooperates and co-causes effects with creatures. And the model he adopts for thinking about God's cooperation with creatures is a little bit different than Aquinas's. So as we saw, Aquinas thought that creatures act through God's power to cause being, that almost like tools wielded by an artisan, creatures, they act within that power of God to cause being. But as I just said, Scotus doesn't really, worry about creatures, needing God's help to cause being. So he adopts a model which I follow others in referring to as a model of independently or autonomously operating co-causes. So the way Scotus thinks of God and creatures is that each of them independently and autonomously posits a causal contribution to a joint effect. So to get the effect, you need both God and creatures cooperating and acting towards the production of the effect, but neither one moves the other one or like wields the other one as a tool, or neither operates through the power of the other in causing the effect. A model that Scotus, or an analogy that Scotus uses for the model, is the analogy of a male and female cooperating in reproduction to cause a child. So you can't get a child without a male and a female's reproductive contribution, but it isn't as if one cause moves the other cause, or as if the one cause acts through the other cause's power. So Scotus prefers this model where there's just a separation and an autonomy in the positing of the causal contribution. But at least in several of his works, he says that both are necessary. So I've qualified some of what I've said about Scotus with in some of his works that, at some points in his career, because I have some work that shows, building on the work of others, of course, that Scotus did waver a bit in his views on especially how God cooperates with the created will in producing its act.
Yeah.
At some points in his career, I think he's just too worried about the autonomy of the will, and he's concerned with having even God being a direct and immediate cause of the will's act. So it's Scotus's views were a little bit unsettled. He died, rather fairly untimely, and he never seemed to have really worked out his views on this point to satisfaction.
Yeah. The third view you cover in that chapter, also from the medieval period, is Peter John Olevy's. You call it the mere conservationism view. What is that view?
Yeah, so Olevy's view is one of the more radical views in the period, definitely a minority position. But as I've shown in some of my work, there certainly are some other figures who've held this view that Olevy defends. And it's actually the one that Scotus, I think, was leaning towards, at least for the created will, nearing the end of his life. So Olevy is very motivated by maintaining a really robust conception of human free will. And he's also really concerned about the issue of God's causal involvement in sins. He's worried that if God is too intimately involved in the production of the created will's action, then God is going to be too intimately connected in the causation of sinful actions. And, everyone in this period believes that God is perfectly good, and that while he might permit certain sins for a greater good, no one wants God actively and immediately willing to bring about sinful actions. And so Olevy's worried about the views we've seen earlier that we just discussed in Aquinas and Scotus, that they make God, too causally responsible for sin. So Olevy's view gets referred to as mere conservationism because he believes that God merely or only conserves creatures and being while they are the sole immediate total causes of their actions. So on Olevy's view, God is only immediate cause of creaturely actions by sustaining the creature. That's a necessary condition for the creature to cause its action, but God's only causal involvement is sustaining the creature in being. So yeah, Olevy's view is, fairly controversial. Like Albert the Great, for example, discusses it in some of his works. Albert says that, his view is all but vanished from the lecture hall because many people found it heretical. So he's not talking about Olevy himself, but just other earlier figures who held that kind of view. But then, by the time of Olevy, it seems that it's becoming a little bit more popular again.
Yeah. Well, thanks for briefly explaining each of these views, which we know is tricky to do in this format when you've read and written so much about these issues. Are there any potential problems for any of these views? You've kind of already hinted at some of the problems. And do you think any of them is right, or at least has an edge over the others? How would you assess them overall?
Yeah, so the big problem I think that medieval authors and authors today, such as Frodoso, for example, find with a view like Alevi's, the mere conservationism, is that it seems to admit that there are realities that aren't immediately created by God. So if the two dog parents, for example, are the sole immediate causes of the baby dog, then it seems like, at that point where the baby dog is coming into existence, at that point in time, God is just sustaining those dog parents, and he's not doing anything different in his causality at that moment when that new creature is coming into being. And so it might look there that like God's role of creator is being relegated to a smaller role, since God would only be, immediately and directly creating, like the first set of beings, and then he just sustains those beings and they immediately cause, the beings that come after them. So that's, the big problem that people raise with the Levy's view. I mean, Scotus was concerned too with a view like that about omniscience. How would God know
Mm-hmm.
things without, just standing back and waiting for things to unfold? A lot of medieval figures think that God knows what happens in creation by knowing his own causality. And if God wasn't an immediate cause of certain effects, he couldn't know whether or not they come into being without, just kind of from the outside passively watching what the other causes do in creation. So that's another concern with that view. And then the third concern would be just that issue of exercising providence. God would have to overpower creatures from, the outside externally to, have any control over what effects they caused. So those are some.
Did Levy address any of these issues in Providence or Omniscience?
He does address the issue about just God's causality of being. He says that, still everything depends on God since he's sustaining it all. I don't think he addressed the issue of providence and God's control over creatures in his works. It's been a while since I've looked at those primary texts, though, so it might be somewhere in there. But yeah, he mainly, because I think in the debate that he was within, the main concern was more that ontological question of making sure that all being is stemming from God. So he focuses a little more on that, trying to show how God would still be the source of all being, though just mediately so rather than immediately as a cause of things that are caused by other realities. So other views and issues with them. So one of the things with Scotus that very early on, like just the generations of Scotus after Scotus's death, noticed in his works, and some of the contemporary scholarship of Scotus is discussed a little bit, is on that immediate co-cause model. One of the issues that gets raised is, how does God know how to co-cause with the created will? So Scotus's claim, at least in some of his works, is that, when I will X, God and I independently and autonomously contribute to the causation of my willing X. But how does God know to contribute to willing X rather than willing Y, or not willing anything at all? And so very early on, Scotus had said that Scotus's view needs to be supplemented with middle knowledge. And some followers of Scotus hypothesized that maybe even Scotus had something like this in mind. And so just to briefly summarize, middle knowledge is the idea that God has knowledge of counterfactuals about what any created cause would freely choose in any situation. So someone who defends middle knowledge would say, oh, well, God knows how to cause with me whether to contribute to X or Y, is because God has this pre-volitional, just hypothetical knowledge of what any cause would choose in any situation. There are some things in Scotus's works that seem kind of to be at odds with the ideas involved in middle knowledge, but also it seems like you need something like that to make the co-causality model work. So depending on where a person stands on middle knowledge, which is a very, kind of controversial idea in philosophical theology, I think that might lead them to, take a stand one way or the other on the independent co-cause model, at least for the created will's volitions. With Aquinas, one of the issues that people have raised with his model is, so as I was saying, Aquinas says that God causes, sort of God supplies that power to cause being, whereas creatures are specifying or determining the type of being that's caused. So when God cooperates with the dog powers, a dog is caused. When he cooperates with the cat powers, a cat is caused. So some objections that got raised in the medieval period and get repeated today is that this model doesn't make sense because being can't be caused independently apart from causing a type of being. So the worry is that you can't basically like separate the being and the nature essence of something
Mm-hmm.
and cause them separately. And I don't know that that objection really is problematic, because when we think of that case of the person making the bed make the bed with using the saw, you could raise the same objection. Well, you can't make a bed without cutting, but you can't cut without cutting something. Like, I think it's
Mm-hmm.
possible for two causes to be, you know, intimately connected and causing a total joint effect, but still you can trace certain features of the effect back to one or the other. And that doesn't imply that those features can be caused separately. For example, like the cause is more responsible for, basically the dimensions of the cuts. If you use a saw that's like, more precise, you're going to get like a different look to the cuts. And the bed maker
Mm-hmm.
is responsible for why it's a bed and not a table. But it doesn't mean that you can cause a table without cutting, or cutting without causing something. Like, it's totally possible. We can see from, cases around us that two causes can be total joint causes together of an effect, while certain features trace back to one or the other independently.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm sure there are a lot more objections people could think of to all of these views, but those are just some of the
Right.
main ones that get raised.
Thanks for that. We've been focusing on these three views with developments in the medieval period. Are any of these views still held and defended today? What other views could one have about divine causation and creaturely action?
Yeah, so I think that like the general views are very much still defended today, especially in
Mm-hmm.
debates in the sphere of theology and science. There are a lot of discussion about how God and natural causes work together, and you see versions of these views being advanced. There are a lot of people in the contemporary theology and science debates that, I think defend something like Aquinas's or Scotus's models, but they might use different analogies to specify it. They might there's a lot of talk about just like different planes of causality at work, or different levels of causality. But I think that
Mm-hmm.
language might be getting at the same idea of, that you find in the medieval period in Aquinas and Scotus, just that both God and creatures are necessary for bringing about effects in creation, but they each supply something different. Their powers are each sort of ordered towards different aspects of what's caused. Definitely in contemporary philosophy of religion, there are mere conservationists. There's not, I'd say, in contemporary philosophy of religion as much interest in these questions as there were in the Middle Ages. They just don't seem to be the most pressing topics. I think probably if a listener wanted to get more into this debate, maybe the area to look would be more in people working in theology and science today. There's
Mm-hmm.
more discussion on God's involvement in nature in the ordinary course of events.
Is there anything else we should have asked about, or would you want to say what new directions work on divine causation and creaturely action might lead?
Yeah, so I guess I could talk a little bit about some of the new directions, at least in the scholarship in medieval philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure many listeners haven't heard of Peter John O'Leary, for example, and there are many other
Right.
figures in the
Yeah.
medieval period that haven't been worked on as much as Aquinas and Scotus. And so there are several people working, including myself, on looking at lesser studied medieval figures and the insights we can gain from their views in these medieval debates as well. So some of them are refining and strengthening the general views we've talked about today. Others are engaged in applying the views to certain problems like the causation of sin. And I think there's going to be some more exciting developments as this medieval scholarship unfolds more. There might be some new views and new issues coming to light that'll be of interest to contemporary philosophers in religion and also in the science and theology discussions as well.
Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much, Gloria, for joining us. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
So I have a website. It's just gloriafrost.org. And on my website, I mentioned some of my current projects and some links to publications on there as well. So that's a good place to find my current research.
Perfect.
Cool. Yeah, thanks again, Gloria.
Thank you.
In our next episode, we'll talk about divine providence and free will, and our guest will be Alan Rhoda.